if I don't have an order book, I'm at the mercy of the market. You're also at the mercy of the market if you do have your own order book.
This is the Time on Wing podcast. I'm Courtney Miller with Visual Approach Analytics. Welcome back. With me, as always, Garrick Deschavon of Collateral Verifications. Garrick, who are we talking to today?
Today, we are talking to two gentlemen. First is John Shavinsky, and so both of them, the reason why we have them both on, both John Shavinsky and we also have Mike Platt on today. So they actually, a little earlier this year, started a company called Jumpseat Advisor. Both of these guys have great backgrounds, and so we'll start with John. John, who's obviously current partner, Jumpseat Advisor, but he was also an operating partner at IT Management. He was principal at LAS Consulting for a little bit. He did a stint at Willis as a senior consultant of asset acquisitions and trading. He was the CEO at Intrepid Aviation. He was also SVP at CIT Aerospace, which is where I first met John and worked with him for a couple of years. Prior to that, he was VP at ILFC. He was also an engineer at Boeing. He has got a Bachelor of Science from Penn State University and Doctor of Law from Seattle University. He's also a pilot and a certified flight instructor. We also have Mike Platt. Mike is currently also partner at Jumpseat Advisor. He was vice chairman and CEO at LCI, and he was CEO at AIM Aerolease for a little bit. He was CIO at Aircastle. He was SVP at ILFC, where I think he did most of his stint in the industry. But he was also a legal counsel for McDonnell Douglas Finance Corp. He's got a BS from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a law degree from the University of Virginia School of Law. So both lawyers, which I didn't realize that they were both lawyers. But anyway, it's going to be a great discussion with them, kind of hearing about what's going on and how they got their start. So Mike and John, this is your Time on Wing.
Just a quick intermission before we continue with the show. We do get a lot of questions about how our listeners can support the show, and frankly, the easiest way is to continue the spirit of the show, which is just to reach out to us at conferences. But we also run businesses as well, and you can support us by supporting a lot of the work that we do. You can support the work that I do through Visual Approach by visiting visualapproach.io, where we produce a lot of research and analysis, a lot of data visualizations.
From my side, obviously, I focus more on the metals, so anything that's aircraft related, if you're looking for valuations, whether it's on aircraft engines, I'm happy to help with any of those types of projects. So we appreciate certainly the opportunities to work with all of you. And we certainly also appreciate just the fact that people are willing to listen to what we have to say and enjoy kind of our thoughts and takes on what we think is a fascinating industry. So thank you.
Okay, back to the show.
John, Mike, thanks for being on the podcast. It's really nice to have you on. Obviously, I've known you guys for a long time, so it's great to have you to kind of share your thoughts on aviation and your backgrounds. And so as we start, like all of our shows, we'd love to hear kind of how you got your start in aviation, where the passion came from. We're all aviation geeks here, so we'd love to hear kind of where the starts were. So John, why don't we start with you?
Can I point out, before we start, we flipped the proverbial coin, and that's how we chose John to go first. I just to be fair.
Just to be fair. That's right, yeah. So, but John, so let us know, like, what got you into aviation?
Yeah, so I think Mike won the toss, so that makes me go first.
He deferred.
He deferred to the second half.
I get the ball in the second half.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Courtney and Garrick, thanks for asking us to, do an episode of your podcast, and we're excited to be here and contribute and our thoughts and the like, and hopefully make this a little bit entertaining for people. My background, I started in aviation as an engineer. My first job out of college was at Boeing, and in the 80s. And
what was that? Was that the 80s? Was that the
yeah?
For those that couldn't hear.
Yeah. In fact, side note, when about the first year I was there, Boeing announced they were going to stop producing the 727.
Wow.
And here I was, I'm 25 years old, right? And all these, old guys were like, oh, that was the first airplane I ever worked on, and I thought, wow, these guys have been doing this a long time, and, they seem, like ready for retirement and everything. Well, fast forward, here I am, and all the airplanes I worked on are out of production now. I think the only thing they still build that I worked on was 737, but that was a classic. So they've already had the NG and the Max. Right,
it was two
versions ago.
Yeah.
What about
anyway,
was the 7.6? Did I see the 7.6 on your?
Yeah, I did work on the 767. They do make a few airframes. Still, they have the tanker, I believe, right, for the military, and
the freighter's
like.
still coming out too.
Yeah. So,
Trickling out,
but that didn't exist when I was. They had the 7.5 package freighter back then, but I don't think there was a. I don't know if there was a 7.6 version in my tenure. And anyway, so I was there for a number of years, and had Boeing's a great company for a new out of college engineer, because if you want to learn about aviation, excuse me, you can move around the company. You're not changing employers, right? You could transfer, and I kind of made it my own on the job training program, and I moved around a couple different departments, and my first role was in customer training, and it was on the 757, 767 avionics suite. Mostly I did communication systems while I was there, and then I went to flight test. I was on the 747-400 flight test program, and the tail end of the 767, we still had it in the fleet for a test bed, but the 7.6 had already been in service for a number of years before I joined the flight test department. Great job. I mean, that's like an engineer's dream. Like every kid in college who wants to be an engineer, that's the kind of thing you want to do. Like you design something, you figure out how to build it, you work with the mechanics to kind of figure it out, what works, what doesn't. You go install it on the plane, and then go fly and watch it all kind of come together. So a lot of fun. Probably the best, most fun job that I had in aviation, to be honest. It was, if I could be 25 to 30, the rest for a lifetime, it would have been terrific.
Now, was it the job, or was it being 25 or 30?
No, it was the job. I mean, like I said, it's like working in your basement, or garage, hobby shop, and it's a experimental flight test. I mean, it's exciting. It was probably more risky than I appreciated at that age too. The whole, it's experimental flight test. I mean, it's got experimental in the name, so that I guess says it all. And then from there, I went to flight crew operations. I was an avionics specialist. It's sort of that department had several functions. One is kind of human factors, the whole flight deck arrangement, instrumentation. That group kind of brought the magenta line for navigation into commercial aviation, because the 757-67 was the first glass cockpit and the first in commercial aviation, right? It was a military technology they brought over. But now all airliners, every general aviation pilot knows about the GPS magenta line. So it was cutting edge stuff, at the time. And then I went to customer engineering and the like, and which is sales support for people who aren't familiar with the Boeing lingo, and go out and meet with the airlines and be involved in the sales campaigns and so forth. And it was a lot of fun. And anyway, from there, after Boeing, I went to ILFC, International Lease Finance Corporations, where I met Mike, and we worked together in the 90s. And I was in the department that did all the buyer furnished equipment purchasing, specification management, and that kind of negotiation with the airlines and Boeing and all the suppliers. And then I moved to New York. So I was originally from the East Coast, and ILFC was in Southern California. And the family was growing. let's say, and we thought we should move back to kind of home base where I still had, family members and the like in the area. So we moved here.
Babysitters is what we call them.
What's that?
Free babysitters. That's what we call them.
Yeah, right. Which, I had a lot of friends in Los Angeles and Southern California, but, family's a whole different, thing, right? So, here I am. Now I live in Connecticut. I went to work in New York for CIT Aerospace. I was there for, that was the longest continuous role that I had. And again, for those that aren't familiar with CIT, which eventually got acquired by Avalon, but I left even before that. I headed up everything that wasn't sales, so I had oversight of technical services, asset management, new aircraft acquisition, and strategic planning for the company. And great team, really enjoyed it. That's where I met Garrick, actually. Mm-hmm. We worked together for a number of years, and then I was the COO at Intrepid Aviation, which was originally based out of Memphis, Tennessee. We recapitalized the company, moved it to Connecticut, where the sort of new management was already located for the most part. Turned that around. I think when we came in, the new team came in, we had about, and I'm probably not, I don't remember the exact figures, but we had like 3 airplanes. I think they were A300s, and let's say they were worth, I don't know, $2-3 million a piece, something like that. They were kind of run out and tired, which we ended up selling for part out. So whatever that is, let's call it 5 million times 3, right? 10 million times 3, 30 million. In 3 years, we raised additional equity. We took delivery of a bunch of new A330s, passenger aircraft, leased those out, and built the balance sheet up to about $1 billion. So that was a real successful endeavor. Then after that, I went out on my own. I've been consulting. I've had a number of clients, and just finished an engagement earlier this year. And then Mike called me up and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I said, I don't know what's next. And we came up with the idea of launching Jumpseat Advisors. So before we get into all that, I guess that's enough of my resume. I'll turn it over to you guys.
Before you start, Mike, I just want to point out how many times on this podcast we've heard amazing stories start out with, and Mike called me and he was like, "Hey, what you doing?" And it was,
and it goes from there,
And then here we are talking to you guys.
Yeah, I know, exactly. John, I did have a question. So what drove you to get into engineering? So you went to Penn State, right? So what drove you to what kind of got you excited about doing engineering, especially like aviation? What was before that?
Yeah. So well, if you really want to go deep dive here, in high school, believe it or not, I really, in the back of my mind, aviation was sort of seemed out of reach. Like it didn't seem like something I could ever really do.
I could see that.
Yeah, and I didn't know anything about it. Like there's a saying that that to be successful, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically the most successful people are people that are successful in the endeavors that their fathers did or their parents did. And my father did not have an aviation background. He's a little bit of a techie guy. He was in the Navy and worked for the Army department after he retired from the Navy. And so, like the whole tech idea thing was sort of embedded. I was, good at math and like science and so forth. So I was headed that way. Then when I was thinking about applying to college, I thought maybe aerospace engineering would be an area that I would study. And I was all set to do that. And I didn't. I ended up going into electrical engineering because only knew one person who was an engineer. It was a friend of the family. I had lunch with this guy, and his advice was, if you're in aerospace engineering, you're kind of locked into an industry. But if you're an electrical or mechanical engineer, you kind of have a broader, base to career wise. So I ended up picking electrical engineering, and that's why there's a lot of avionics involved in my career path because of that. Yep.
Yeah.
And then when I got to Boeing, Boeing had a program with the University of Washington where the UW professors taught night classes at Boeing. So they would come to our offices. And Boeing's got offices all over the Seattle area, right? But they'd come to a Boeing facility, and they taught classes on aerodynamics, airplane performance, fluid dynamics, and I took all the classes. Every one that they offered. So I thought, all right, I got an electrical engineering background, but if I'm going to work for the biggest airplane company in the world, then maybe I should know something about airplanes. So that's
Very
it.
cool.
That's the answer.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. I like it. I didn't know that. Right, and one of the things I didn't know about you.
All these years.
I know all these years. That's right.
It's not something that comes up that often, I guess.
No, but it's interesting. It's interesting. Yeah. So what about? All right, let's move on to you, Mike. How did you get started with what you're doing today?
Was there any time left? But
Yeah,
that's
all the time we got for today. It's a good thing
That's
we're
why
not.
I have a 5-minute podcast.
It's a good thing we're not 5-minute time on wing.
Yeah, we couldn't get anything done.
But you are going to edit, right? You can take out as much as you like.
I'm not taking any of it out. If anybody says, "Hey, you'll edit, right?" That's my cue to keep the stuff in.
that's the good. I fell into this. So I was a guy that did not have a passion for aviation. Probably one of the few people you meet in this business. I had no idea what I was going to do. I was working at a law firm. And in 1987, there was a big stock market crash, and there was basically no work. And I was trying to fill my time, writing stock option plans and employee manuals, and I hated every minute of it. And I wanted to do something transactional. And I got a call from somebody that said, McDonnell Douglas Finance Corporation is looking for a lawyer. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, well, you know what GE Capital is? They're going to be the next GE Capital. They're going to be all over the place doing all kinds of financing. So I went up there. It was, I was in San Diego. This was Long Beach. It was easy. I went up for the day, and I really liked the guys. And I joined there, and I started doing auto leasing and, computer leasing and truck leasing. And I was there probably 5-6 months. And the president of the company walked into my office and he said, I just had lunch with the head of commercial aircraft, and they're trying to get a deal done to sell a DC-10 to a company up in San Francisco. And they said they don't have any lawyers that can get the deal done. So I offered you. And I said, what? What's a DC-10? And they said, you're going to get a call from a guy named Al Nigro. He's the sales.
Oh, my goodness.
So Al called me. He said, meet me at the Long Beach airport tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. We're going to San Francisco to see GATX and Glenn Hickerson.
And Al was with Douglas at the time?
What was that?
Al was with Douglas at the time?
Al was with Douglas.
Yeah,
He was the sales guy for Douglas after leaving, flight testing. And we went up to San Francisco, and basically the deal was done. There was nothing to do except put a date on the document. And we talked to Glenn for a while, and he had just bought a new boat, so we talked about that for a while. And they signed the documents, and we came home. And I don't think I did anything or said anything. But Glenn was nice enough to call my boss, George Rosen at the time, actually was George's predecessor, and say, that guy was great. We got the deal done in like 20 minutes. And all of a sudden, I was in aircraft. That was it.
Nice.
That was fast. And I spent 5 years at McDonnell Douglas Finance Corporation, and then McDonnell Douglas got into its troubles, and we all know what happened there, and it ended up being part of Boeing. But it was sort of like everything we built up, we were selling off, and the days were numbered. And at that point, ILFC was looking for a lawyer. So I went to ILFC. And I worked there as a lawyer for a few years. And one of the guys that I worked a lot with was John Evans. And after several years there, John and I had traveled all over the world doing deals together. John left. And it was such a small company that I was really the only person left that knew his customers. So I kind of took him over, and I was doing legal and marketing and other things. And at some point I had to make a choice, and I moved over to the marketing area. And at that point, you kind of develop a passion for this. You drink the aviation fuel, and you're traveling around the world, and you're having a good time, and you're learning from all the experts on the technical side and the engineering side and purchasing groups, and people like Steve Hazy, people like John Pluger, and many others. And it was a lot of fun, and I had a great time there. And I learned a tremendous amount and saw the world and met a lot of people. And then at some point, I just kept getting these recruiting calls, and I kept turning them down from this company in Connecticut. It's Air Castle that had just gone public. And the recruiter ended up calling my house on a weekday, knowing I wouldn't be there. And my wife answered the phone, and she said, "Why aren't you talking to these guys? Yeah, they were very nice."
That's genius.
Back door. And I ended up at Air Castle for a couple of years, and then left there. And after about 2 years, and I had this idea that I'd start my own little leasing company doing Bombardier Q400s, an airplane I really liked, but it was competing, with the ATR 72, and ATR was just killing Bombardier at the time. And it became apparent at some point that this just wasn't going to work. And at that point, I decided to call some old friends of mine at LCI, the guys that started LCI. I'd sold them their first aircraft when I was at ILFC, and I joined them, and I spent until now at LCI. So I was the CEO of LCI, eventually became the vice chairman there, and I'm sort of retiring from LCI as we speak, and doing some other things. So I called John and said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I don't know. What are you doing?" I said, "Well, how much do you want to work?" And, we both sort of had the same idea that, after 35 years of doing aircraft finance and aircraft leasing for a number of different companies, we probably had some valuable insight. And we had seen so many mistakes made in the past by so many airlines. And we thought, we can help guide airlines through this process, investors through this process. And we think that it would be valuable to the lessors as well, because, you want a customer that knows what they're doing, that's educated, that doesn't, the worst customer is the guy that you put the 150-page lease in front of him and he says, "Where do I sign?" You can almost guarantee the shorter the lease negotiation, the quicker the default. It almost always happens that way. So we thought, we talked to some of our friends in the leasing community, and they thought it would be a valuable asset to them. We thought it'd be valuable to airlines, and that's where we are. That's what I've done.
I'm very interested in pulling that data on lease negotiations versus default rate. That's got to be the straight line going up and to the right.
I think it is.
Or down and to the right.
Well, actually, I think it's a little bit of a bell curve, right? Because, and this is part of what Mike and I thought really could help. When we were leasing airplanes, our experience and all of our friends that are, in various leasing companies today feel that if you have a inexperienced lessee and they're trying to do their first lease, they don't know what they don't know, right? So they make issues that are well established, market customs or customary business arrangements. They challenge those, and you spin your wheels round and round and round on stuff that a more savvy or knowledgeable lessee would just, they can separate the real issues from the imaginary ones. And everyone, so I think, yeah, if it's too quick, then they probably didn't do their homework, and they're going to default quickly because they just want to get the airplane, try to get going. They're not really, they've got other issues, right? And it's a startup airline, or maybe it's a struggling airline, what have you. But the other end of that bell curve is where it takes an excruciatingly long time to get a lease done because, again, they're tilting at windmills, right? So our idea is to try to help those that need assistance through the process. It's better for the airline, better for the investor, whoever is on the other side of the table from the lessor, to get a good quality contract that's going to work for both sides for the duration of the lease.
Yeah, and I would add to that, an airline may be very sophisticated. Maybe a big airline, they may have a big fleet department, they have a big finance department, they know what they're doing, but they have no idea what the other 300 airlines around the world have been able to negotiate. They only know what they've done and what's important to them. Yeah. And sometimes you say to them, there's this issue here that you could address this way. And they look at you like, wow, why didn't we ever think of that? But we've had the experience of doing this with 300 airlines and each of us 3 or 4 different leasing companies. So we've seen so much more than even the most sophisticated airline because they only know what they do. So I think there's great value here. And, just before John and I formed this, I worked with another guy who had a big Asian airline client that was looking to lease a bunch of wide-body aircraft. And they presented us with several LOIs that they had and asked us to provide comments. And I went through them and provided some comments. And they said, thank you very much. And I think they got most of what we asked for. But I realized that's not really the best way to do this because we gave them millions of dollars of value for a few hours of work. There are better ways to do it from our perspective and from the airline's perspective. So I think, having a partner that you can rely on, that you're not leaving things on the table, you're not going to get surprised 8 years later, that in all likelihood that lessor is going to sell that aircraft to somebody else before it ever returns, and you're going to be dealing with people that are reading the words of the contract and couldn't care less about the relationship. You better get it right the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's right. I've sat through negotiations several times. Now, most of mine were from the OEM side. So you want an airplane, you give us money, and we give you the airplane deposit. But there was no trading going on. But other negotiations, you get stuck up on some of that language, and they say, yeah, well, we all know what we're talking about. Like, yeah, but does the next guy? Like, that's the problem. Right.
And they didn't used to be. I mean, when John and I first started, it was rare that there was a next guy. Basically you return the aircraft to the guy you leased it from. There were very few leasing companies. Today, there's well over 100, maybe 200 entities that buy and sell used aircraft. And it's very common. Almost all aircraft are sold before the end of the leases. So, again, you better get it right.
Yeah. So ideally, like when you guys think about your perfect customer, your perfect client, like where do you see the value there, right? What's the ideal customer for you guys where you feel like you're going to give the fullest value based on your experience?
I think it's a growing airline. I think it's somebody that may lease their first, pick an aircraft, I don't know, a 737 MAX. And
I would have said 727, but...
Okay, 727. But whatever it is, and they're probably going to take more over time, and they may end up buying and financing those rather than leasing aircraft in the future. They need to think about this being part of a larger fleet and making sure they set themselves up with, things like BFE providers and what the BFE choices are, because it's not a one-off transaction. People that want to preserve flexibility for future growth, and airlines that want to be efficient and make sure that they are not missing anything. John, other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And also I would include investors, right? There's a lot of private equity firms, other firms that want to invest in aircraft, and they don't even have an aviation department, if you will. A bank, a private equity firm, hedge fund, what have you. And today, I think the market, it's better than it was not too long ago in that the returns are stronger, right? Like COVID was a disaster for everybody, but coming out now, I think you can get better returns than we were seeing a few years ago, and they're starting to look more interesting to those kind of firms as well, and they would totally benefit from some guidance from someone like Mike and I.
Yeah. So and so when you think about kind of the current environment that we're in, right? When you've got the OEM challenges, you've got kind of the MRO constraints, there's all kinds of things that are like presenting challenges, right? How do you see that? I mean, it's definitely, I think, different than 20 years ago. And so whether you're leasing airplanes, whether you're from the leasing side or the airline side, right? How do you handle that, right? How do you kind of prepare your customer to be able to handle delays or handle supplier issues, or how do you look at that to basically kind of better prepare somebody to kind of take on the next 5-10 years?
Interesting question, because I think that today airlines are well aware of these problems, right? When all their engines have to go through the shop and they have grounded airplanes, when they can't get the airplanes they ordered. I don't think 5 years ago anybody really thought about delivery delays. I mean, it's always been in the contract, but it's one of those, you flip the page, it's good enough. Nobody really thought about it. Today, it's a real issue. Manufacturers are coming up with huge amounts of compensation for delays and aircraft on the ground and engines going through shops, and it's a big problem. And one of the things that John and I have found is that one of the groups of airlines that we targeted are smaller airlines that traditionally would have taken used aircraft. But there are no used aircraft trading in the market. All the airlines are holding on to whatever they have because they can't get deliveries that are scheduled. They have engines, again, going through the shop, so percentage of their fleet is grounded, and they're just not letting anything go. So it's a different dynamic today than it was pre-COVID. I think that the A320neo pushed the MAX to come out. They pushed the engine manufacturers both on on both platforms to produce greater fuel efficiency with roughly the same size engines, finer tolerances, different materials, and we pushed technology maybe a little too fast, a little too far, and now everybody's paying the price for that. It will all settle out over time, but it's going to be a few years, and maybe it's a good thing to keep down capacity. Imagine if all that capacity were in the market today, where would the market be? There's an argument that airlines would be struggling with excess capacity. They've been able to make a little money during this time because of less capacity. So everybody's whining and complaining, and some people, really are missing the lift. But for an entire industry, I think there's a good argument that reduced capacity is helpful.
So I agree with that wholly and entirely, but tell that to an airline CEO who's watching his market share stagnate or drop. Like, there's a reason why everybody wants the capacity, right? Like, you see how that overcapacity arrives in the industry. However, I am of the opinion that, especially given the season, and we will get this out before the holiday season. So for those listening, I highly recommend you do this, especially if you're with an airline. One, call John and Mike. But two, make sure you write a Christmas card to Boeing and Airbus and say, thank you for preventing us from ruining our own business. Thank you for being so terrible at getting us airplanes that we didn't kill ourselves.
Another result. I mean, if you just look at today's press, I think Air India ordered another 100 aircraft today.
Yeah.
The numbers are astounding. So between their Boeing and Airbus orders, I think they have like 450 or 480 aircraft on order. What does that really mean? What's going to happen?
Yeah, and by the way, I think it's 570 with the latest. I know, which is crazy.
With inflation?
With inflation, yeah. But no, right, and I totally agree. I mean, because from that, when you think about, and they're not the only ones, right? You've got Indigo, which has huge orders. You've got Wizz, huge orders. And at what point, does the backlog of the manufacturers become so heavily concentrated because they're with big customers and only big customers that prevent anybody else from basically ordering airplanes anytime soon, right? And then all it takes is for one of those guys to go out of business or to have problems, and then what happens, right? So I don't know.
But let's think about that a little bit, right? Because Lion Air used to do this all the time,
right?
I mean, it's not new. Now the quantities are higher, but the backlogs are way longer, right? So if I'm Air India and I'm looking at, and I go to Toulouse and I go to Seattle and I ask when can I get airplanes, and they're like, oh, let me check my portfolio here. Yeah, 2030, never, right? Like you're effectively taking options at that point. You are signing up for airplanes that are almost guaranteed to be after the next global economic downturn if they arrive every 10 years. So there are options, but I'd be willing to bet the OEMs almost see it the same way. They won't let them out of deliveries. I'm not saying they're not firm deliveries, but they're looking at this being like, they're taking the PDPs. Absolutely. That's money in the bank. And they're like, well, we can double book a little bit here. We'll worry about production when we get there. We can move stuff around. We can horse trade if we need to. We're talking 10 years out. It's different than when we were talking 2 to 3.
Is that some of these airlines turn into leasing companies, right?
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So both Boeing and Airbus, and I've had conversations with both of them in the past. They have their forecast, and they forecast how much of their production is going to go to various airlines, and then how much they're going to sell to leasing companies. And I was with a leasing company, and I said, "You guys got it wrong because you're selling to Indigo and Lion Air and some of these others that had this. Air Asia was another one at the time." Have this model of a massive order book. They keep the airplanes to the first heavy check. They don't do the maintenance. They sell them as is, and those aircraft then become part of the leased fleet. And neither Boeing or Airbus accounts for that. They just see it once it's sold to an airline. It's an airline sale, and then it's a used airplane. They don't really follow the aircraft any further, right? So it's a challenge for lessors, frankly, because now you're competing with all this other money that's bringing 6-year-old airplanes into the lease pool and competing with them, and it's not part of anybody's forecast, right? So if you're a savvy lessor, you want to be monitoring that to not shoot yourself in the foot thinking, we got a great order book because the demand is X and the supply is Y, when in fact it's Y plus. Right.
And if you're a lessor today and you're trying to come up with your strategy for the next 5 years, well, today you're competing with 150 other guys on every sale leaseback. So unless you have the lowest cost of capital and can provide the lowest economics, you're going to lose. There's no relationship business there. That's simply, you got the money, what's the best deal? So what do? You place orders for new aircraft that are going to come in 6, 7, 8 years? Or do you say, how about these big orders? Maybe I'll hang around the sale leaseback market 7-8 years from now and hope some of these other guys aren't in business anymore. There's some M&A in the lessor business, but you have to figure out what's going to be available to you. And I think a lot of lessors are saying, you know what, there's always going to be 100 lessors out there competing. I need to have my own order book because that's the only way I can control my growth in my inventory. And then if I want to add to that in the sale leaseback market or the M&A markets, fine. But if I don't have an order book, I'm at the mercy of the market. And then, you're also at the mercy of the market if you do have your own order book, because who knows what the economics are going to be at the time you take delivery. And if
it's the one product in the world, right?
Then you got to pay escalation for the next 8 years.
Right.
We haven't even touched escalation yet.
Yeah.
So you're placing an order. You don't know what you're going to get, when you're going to get it, how much it's going to cost. Just like sign here, and that's the nature of these long-term order books. And it's a challenge. When I was at CIT to try to combat that, we called an audible. And we developed what we called the small frequent order strategy. So rather than placing an order for 50 airplanes and trying to time the market and get the best price, while the OEMs were motivated, and then worry what's going to happen when that last airplane that's, it's 3 or 4 or 5 years to the first one delivers, and then it's another 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years till the last one delivers after that. So you got a long horizon that you have to try to assess. So our strategy was, okay, let's just order fewer planes with a smaller time horizon. So we had to wait for the first one, still had to wait a couple of years, but the last one in that group of 10, let's say, instead of being 8 or 9 or 10 years into the future from the first delivery, was maybe 4 or 5, right? So it shrinks the time horizon that you have to analyze. The other thing the other virtue of this was we didn't time the market. When we needed inventory, we placed an order. Sometimes the OEMs were motivated and we got a lower price. Sometimes a little less motivated and we had to pay a little bit more. But the analysis was that on the whole, we were doing about the same. So
dollar cost averaging.
Yeah, basically dollar cost averaging. Yeah, exactly right.
So do you think that's still a viable strategy today when you have to wait 7 to 8 years to get airplanes? I mean, that's a long timeline, right? So how do you view that as a lessor?
Yeah, it's even tougher when that first delivery is still 8 years away, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, the way the PDPs work, you guys know, right? You pay a little bit up front, but then they're all timed to the future delivery date, right? So not a lot happens. You're not making huge payments early. They're all, 12, 18, 24, 30 months back from delivery. So it all slides out. Problem is you don't have any clue what the interest rate environment's going to be 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now. And can you wait, right? If you're a lessor, if you're an investment firm and you want to launch a leasing platform today, you have to do it in the secondary market because you can't wait. Investors don't want to wait 8 years to start seeing a return.
Right.
So,
that's interesting.
But by the way, one last footnote on this. Again, understanding that dynamic, if you're a lessee, can help you optimize a lease for your book, right?
Yeah, I mean, from your perspective as Jumpseat Advisors, is that right? Am I getting that right?
Yeah,
Advisor with a sick one, no S.
No S.
Advisor.
Oh,
Jumpseat
so
Advisor.
only one of you goes?
There's only one of us.
one of you at a time. That's right.
Yeah, one at a time.
As one.
It's a collective. It's a collective. Yeah.
So
one fee, you get the whole firm.
I mean, Mike, you made a point a couple of minutes ago about you're signing, say, from an airline perspective, an 8-year commitment. What happens at year 8? You have all the return conditions and all those type of things. from the perspective of the airline that even knows what they're doing, the question kind of is, think back 8 years ago. How would you have negotiated a lease 8 years ago that was going to return today? What would you have thought about? Right? Like, what has changed in that 8 years? What have you learned, say, over that 8 years? I mean, we've mentioned inflation. You mentioned interest rates. I mean, that was, until about 22. That was, I don't know, 0 point whatever on the Fed side, right? Okay, so let's project that forward. What are the assumptions? So if we look back 8 years ago, what are the assumptions we took for granted that don't necessarily apply today? And looking forward another 8, where are some of these assumptions that are being made today that you think could be challenged? Without giving away any secrets.
Yeah, I'll take a little shot at that. If we look at where the technology cycles, so we have on the wide body side, 350s, 787s, new technology. That new technology will be with us probably for at least 20 years, maybe 25 years.
As new build technology?
Yes, I don't think we'll see a replacement to that technology for a very long period of time.
I agree.
If you look at the MAX and the Neo, okay, they were both sort of maturations of existing products. They're a little bit better, but was that a patch? Are we going to see new narrow bodies or middle market, mid-size aircraft in the next 10 years? Normally, you would say yes, but the airline industry has been so battered, and the OEMs have been so battered. Boeing is not coming out with a new airplane anytime soon. And if they're not, why should Airbus, right?
Right.
Just keep doing what you're doing. So I think when you look at it, you can say for the next 20 years, we probably will not have new technology that pushes out old technology from the two major manufacturers. I think you also look and you say electric aviation is not going to have any significant impact on passenger traffic or even large cargo traffic for a very, very long time. Will the Russians or the Chinese or the Brazilians or somebody else eat into the market? Maybe on the margins, but not significantly. So I think that if you're an airline planning today, you can say whatever you're acquiring now is going to be good, have a very long life before you need to replace it. You're not going to see the 10% fuel savings aircraft come out, I don't think, in the next 10 years to replace it.
And that's an inflection point in the history of aircraft design and production. Yeah. Right? I've heard this over and over again. Boeing needs to design something because they do every 10 years, 10 years, or 8, whatever the number is, and they're past that. Well, technology will slow down. It's asymptotic, right? You can't just keep taking 20% off the fuel burn. I mean, you can. There's just smaller and smaller numbers.
Well, look what happened with the engines when they tried to do
Absolutely.
that. Right?
And then do the airlines even want it? And I think that's a question that isn't really being asked right now. And I think it's because the airlines don't want to say, no, look, just get what you're building now right.
Yeah. Well, look, every airline, if you're leasing aircraft, you want the most fuel efficient aircraft. And if you're leasing one aircraft for, pick a number, $400,000 a month, and you can lease a more efficient one for $425,000, but you're saving $1 million a month in fuel, it's a no-brainer. But that doesn't mean that it should be built, because, do you think if Pratt & Whitney had the choice today that they had back then, that they would have pushed the technology to where it is? Probably not. If they knowing what they know today, CFM, same thing.
But isn't that the catch with history? You never know what you know today.
You never know. So going back to your question about how you plan, if you know that the technology that you're acquiring you're going to have for a very long time, then you can do much longer leases. And when you do much longer leases, you can take advantage of better economics. You can take advantage of the fact that, hey, when I return this thing, it's going to be a much older aircraft. You're not entitled to a brand new aircraft back. Maybe you get to a half-life standard or something. there are things that you can do if you're willing to go long. I think when COVID hit and everybody had all these aircraft, they wish they had gone short and could return them. You never know what's on the horizon. You never know about geopolitical nightmares. We're seeing them go on every day we open the newspaper. Where is it going to impact the world? Is China going to go into Taiwan at some point? Are we going to have, is the Middle East going to melt down? What's going to happen? What impact does that have? Bottom line is you don't know, and no airline knows. So the more flexibility you can build in, even if you pay for it, is worth it. Because I think most airlines, if they could buy an insurance policy for whatever cost that would allow them to return some of their fleet early or extend that fleet if they needed to, they would pay for that insurance. So why not pay a few $1,000s a month more for the lease rate to get that kind of flexibility?
I think you're onto something. I think this is a product.
Yeah.
Early return insurance.
Find somebody to buy it or to sell it. Because when you get that aircraft back, you're in big trouble.
Yeah, I know. But then you can file and...
But you can buy it from most of the leasing companies.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah. You're effectively, increasing lease rate for a shorter term or option. Yeah.
Or think about your fleet. You should have aircraft that come off lease every year, right? You should stagger your lease terms. You should stagger your extension, early return conditions, and you should build in that flexibility so that when you look at the skyline of your fleet, it can go up and down as you need.
Yeah, and I think your point on just if there's one trend I think post COVID that is most interesting for me long term, it's not what geopolitical conflict is going to arise. It's that geopolitical conflicts are arising much more often now. And just the need for flexibility is the value, if you were, of flexibility, which of course would be airline specific and aircraft specific, and but that's higher than it certainly was in 2019.
Well, with RFK running Health and Human Services in the U.S., we were not going to have any more pandemics, so we don't have to worry about that.
No more fluoride in the water. This is great.
Well, and one of the value propositions that lessors pitch to airlines is don't buy the plane, lease it, because then you have flexibility. And then when you say you're the airline and lessee and you say, okay, well, give us this flexibility, and they go, no, it's a fixed contract. Well, you can't sell me flexibility in one breath and then say I can't have it, in the contract in the next breath, right? So that's exactly the kind of thing that we would be on the lookout for in guiding the process with some airline to lease an airplane. What is it that you're buying? You're not just leasing an airplane. You're buying into a relationship, number one. Number two, you're paying for flexibility. I mean, that's the whole point of leasing versus buying. And there are other value stories around the lease, right? Like tax benefits and financing preferences. And that's exactly the kind of thing that if you're an airline and you've done a lot of leasing, you're going to already know that. But if you're kind of new or, less experienced in the arena, it's something that, I would be the first to point out, Or Mike would be first. I'd be second.
Yeah, he's so is it advisor and sidekick? Is that the
I'm the sidekick, I guess.
I think the story was when we went to reserve the website page or the email, whatever it was, we left the S off by mistake.
In the URL. So we kind of have to live with it.
That's good marketing.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. So that's good. So now we should go and get that domain then. The Jumpseat Advisors with the S.
Yeah. With the S, yeah.
Go for it.
No, you guys are so good. You only need one.
You only need one. That's right. You only need one.
Exactly.
That's right. Yeah. I'm trying to think. So, I guess when you think about, kind of some of the ongoing challenges that we're seeing today, if you put on kind of your lessor hat, or you put it back on, right? I mean, what do you do as a lessor, right? Today, when you think about, so it's, we talked about the challenges in terms of placing an order for an airplane, and that's why you're seeing some, but not as much as I think we've seen in the past. How do you succeed being a lessor today? Right?
Different kinds of lessors. I mean, there are lessors that are in this for the very long run. I mean, AerCap's not going anywhere, right? There are long-term, come back and talk to me 30 years from now, right? Those kind of lessors. And then there are the guys that are in it, for the next 5 years, and they'll sell out and they'll merge, they'll do whatever they do. And the strategies have to be completely different. So it depends on your outlook. One thing that, I think Steve Ozzie taught John and I both is that, absent a pandemic or something, there will always be more people flying in the future than fly today. For the next, let's call it 50 years, the line may have a few blips in it, but it's just going to keep going up. So if you're going to have more passengers and you're going to have more demand for aircraft, you take a view that you can place these long-term orders, because if an aircraft delivers in 5 years or 7 years or 8 years or whatever the backlog is, there will be more people flying then than there are now. Second thing is, you look and you say, how many 10, 15-year-old aircraft are in the market today? And where are they going to go? The less fuel-efficient aircraft, the aircraft that require massive, investments in engine technology, the noisier, polluting aircraft. There's a big replacement cycle. So if you look at the replacement cycle and the growth cycle, you come to some sort of a conclusion on how many aircraft are needed. And that's what Boeing and Airbus do in their forecasts. And I know those are self-serving forecasts, but there is some truth to it when you look at what's going to be retired. And I think we've also seen that the economic useful life of aircraft has decreased over time. Where it used to be, it wasn't uncommon to fly 30-year-old aircraft. You don't see as much of that with major carriers anymore. And maybe it's the fuel efficiency, maybe it's fleet commonality, maybe it's a variety of things. But so I think if you're here for the long term, you can place these long-term orders. But not everybody can do that. So that's part of how I would look at it. What's your time horizon?
Okay. Yeah.
I guess I would also, let me add two other thoughts. One is that in the leasing world, the lessors don't make a whole lot of money leasing airplanes. They make their money on the residual value in selling aircraft. Right? So if you're going to stay afloat leasing aircraft, covering your overhead, covering your depreciation, and covering your interest expense, you got to be efficient. You have to have a lot of aircraft. So size really does matter, because your overhead doesn't go up proportionally with the size of your fleet. So efficiency is important. And I think that, small guys that dabble have to find different kinds of deals than the guys that are doing, billion at a time. That's just a different game. I can't remember what my second point was, but I'll come back to it. So, that's the problem with saying I have 2 points.
But you're only JetStream advisor, so you only go one at a time.
That's true. That's true. John will have the second point.
No, I don't.
No other points. No.
Yeah,
Nice.
I mean, if I look at the leasing space now, right, you mentioned the 10 to 15-year-old airplane, that midlife space and supply and demand. Imagine the supply of those airplanes about 8 years from now. There weren't any, right? I mean, there are no 2-year-old. There are very few 2-year-old airplanes or 3-year-old airplanes, right? So you've got just the different dynamics of the vintages of aircraft that are going to be coming available versus whatever production rates are going to be versus whatever, the economy is doing at the time. And and I know there are exceptions in every market, right? You can always find a buying opportunity, but in the grand context, if ever there was a seller's market, it's been the last 12 to 24 months in the leasing space. So from that challenge of, well, how do I continue to grow and find the buying opportunities? Now, they're there. You have to look in different places. It's not, like you said, it's not the sale leaseback. You're just competing on cost of capital, hoping one of two things happens. Either the residual value is as great as you say it is, or you're retired before you have to actually pay due. Either one works. But I'm so fascinated by this idea that you mentioned of looking forward 8 years and not predicting the future, but building the flexibility to adapt to it, to be the flexible party in the room, to adapt to wherever it is. I find that absolutely it's fascinating.
Well, one thing that I don't think has really been explored yet is airline alliances. Will we get to a point where airlines need the flexibility to move aircraft amongst themselves? And we need more in North America and less in Asia and, et cetera. And they have a natural group of airlines that they're in partnership with for this kind of thing. I mean, they do it with code shares. They do it with all sorts of alliance things now. Maybe that is something that is of value in the future.
May I suggest frequent leasing awards? Get a loyalty program for lessors. The airlines seem to have figured it out. You could give them like miles, or
I think that already exists in terms of those are the guys that get the attention.
Yeah. Frequent flyer, yeah. They
but this idea of
no, go ahead.
of thinking back a number of years, and we're 5 years since COVID hit in 2020, right? So 2019. When I think about 2019, the market, everybody would have said it's overheated, that it's not a good time to
right.
buy airplanes and the like, and production rates were at the highest. They were at the peak, right, of what we've ever seen. All those airplanes that delivered are just now coming up for their heavy checks. So I'm wondering, just during this podcast, it got me thinking, what the analysis looks like on how many aircraft are going to come off lease that went in 2019 that are now, the Indigo, Air India. We started talking about at the beginning of the podcast about how those airplanes would go into the lease market. How does that shift the aircraft availability if they're coming up for heavy checks? And are they going to start moving around a little bit, or are they just going to go through maintenance and stay where they are? I don't know.
And even outside of the question of if they change hands in terms of ownership or lessee, there are a lot of aircraft that are hitting checks, and MRO capacity is one of the bottlenecks today, not to mention spare parts and the actual labor, around the world. It's funny you mentioned that. I actually published research today showing that 25 will be a spike in expirations. It comes down and it picks back up again in 28. There's your 6-year.
Right, so that
probably
matches,
Indigo.
That's 2020, 2021,
right, exactly,
2022,
exactly.
Right?
Yep,
that was the downturn. Right. And then that secondary wave or trough is going to hit a year from now, or 2026, right? 25, 26, 27.
Right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the only difference today is I think because of the environment that we're in, where I think a lot of people are keeping airplanes longer. So I think that's where the extensions come in. And so, but if we weren't in this environment, you could absolutely see, right, airplanes all of a sudden get returned because nobody wants to deal with the heavy checks. Nobody wants to deal with kind of shop visits that are coming due. So that brings up a great point in terms of when we get to that second wave in that 28, 29 timeframe, right? Do you see, at some point this great kind of exodus of airplanes from fleets because they are reaching those levels, and they're also at that point hopefully able to get their new airplanes a bit more consistently than they've been over the last couple of years, right? So is that kind of raises the question of when do we see that next kind of pivotal moment where you start to see adjustments, and does that create opportunities?
Yep.
Mike, you had made kind of a comment about I think it was you, about the amount of new aircraft buying leading into 2019. Actually, on second thought, maybe it was you, John. I want to make sure.
It was me, but it was actually Mike's second point that he couldn't remember.
Got it. Oh, okay. That dynamic is fascinating in how different it is today. So, for instance, price escalation was not a thing. Now, I say price escalation. I say the actual price that's offered, not escalation after you purchase the aircraft. That's always been a thing, right? That's money in the bank for the OEMs. The actual price that had been offered for these aircraft leading into 2019 had been flat for about 10 to 15 years, right?
Yeah.
But what they did, they made up for it in production, right? So it was incentivizing taking the new aircraft. But the point is that and this gets to Mike's earlier point about, aircraft being around for longer, not even just in the new development cycle, but just in the aircraft age cycle, getting back to the 30-year fleets, which, we're already starting to see. I think American said, 30's the new 24 when it comes to narrow bodies. And I wholly believe it. But how do you look at, I guess it shows up in residual values, right? In just the green time on engines, exiting a period where pricing was constant, was level, and production was through the roof, to a period now where production is actually way down and pricing is through the roof. How does that change the overall dynamic for an airline potentially looking 8 years out?
That's a big question. I don't even know how to start unwinding that one. I don't know. I don't have a good answer, like, off the top of my head. There's a lot of pieces to that.
There might not be one, in fairness.
Yeah.
At some point, airlines have to just raise their prices, right? I mean, if you look at the ticket price today to fly, 1,000 miles, certainly after adjusting for inflation, it's less than it was 20 years ago, right? That makes no sense. When airplanes cost 5 times more, when fuel costs 5 times more, when employees cost 5 times more, how is that possible? We're not that much more efficient. So, you have the models like the Ryanair, where you make your money on everything else. Or here, baggage fees and selling food and parking at the airport and, vacations. And the airlines simply can't make enough money without ancillary services, which is why Southwest basically was taken over, and there's a new board at Southwest, because it was a great model for a long time when prices never went up on aircraft, but that doesn't work anymore.
Right.
You see Spirit in big trouble as long as we're being U.S. centric, because it's easy to be, low price, but it's really hard to be low cost. And low price, high cost is a really bad combination. And everybody, basically has the same costs. pilots cost the same, fuel costs the same, lease rates cost the same, insurance costs the same, airport landing slots are the same, navigation fees are the same. So how do you become low cost? Well, you can just keep taking new aircraft and deferring all the maintenance, but eventually that'll catch up to you. It's pretty hard to be low cost. So something's got to give. Either you have to make your money elsewhere, right, through these ancillary sales and services, or you got to raise your ticket prices.
Yeah. So if I can add to that and actually kind of look at your question there, Courtney. I think when you think about, as you said, kind of we went through a period where pricing, didn't necessarily go down or go up, I should say. And it was more made up in volume. So I think what we're going to see is that I think as lessors all of a sudden have to start dealing with remarketing these airplanes that they were taking on in the 2010 to 2019, right? I think it offers them probably more flexibility because they were paying most likely less for the airplanes to be able to, probably deal with another kind of a downturn, right? If you all of a sudden, you've been able to depreciate the asset, you were at a lower base. Now all of a sudden you've got to remarket the airplane. It gives you a bit more flexibility to maybe price the aircraft less on a lease rate to be able to place it elsewhere, right? And so you might start to see that, if the market softens or anything like that. Whereas I think airplanes that were taking over the last couple of years, now all of a sudden when they're starting to come off lease in the 2030s, I think that'll be a challenge, I think, for lessors because they'll have a slightly less capability or flexibility based on the fact that they're probably their book values will be, higher than where they would have been, as compared to a similar airplane like 10 years ago. Right. So I think that those are some of the challenges that you're probably going to see, but I think they are staggered. Right. So I think that there is a bit of a leeway there. But I think that probably, to me, that's how I would look at that, is that it offers, I think, the lessor community a bit more flexibility going into potentially another downturn over the course of the next 5-7 years, because they've got, they've been able to depreciate those assets a little bit more, or at least they should have, to be able to handle that.
Courtney, your last question has got me thinking about this, 300 aircraft that Air India has on order, or whatever it is. And, when I used to lease aircraft in India, and I covered that market for a while, you always heard the idea is we're going to get people out of buses and off of trains and onto airplanes, and people that have never flown before are going to start flying. Well, if the prices of those airplanes keep going up, and the only way for the airlines to stay in business is to charge much higher ticket prices relative to what they're charging today, are you going to be able to get those people off the buses? And if not, then where are those hundreds of aircraft going to go? They're not going to go into that market if people are unable or unwilling to pay those prices. And I don't know if there seems to be a lot of inelasticity, or maybe it's inelasticity to ticket pricing, because if you raise your ticket prices a little bit, nobody wants to fly. It's
or elasticity. Yeah, I know what you mean.
It's more elasticity to this for the price.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. That's what. And so, if Air India in 2026 has to charge, or 2028 has to charge double what they're charging today, what happens to their load factors that they're expecting to go up 20%? Do they come down 20%?
I think, I mean, if history is an example, load factors don't come down, fares do, and the airlines just lose a ton of money. Right? This is because there are revenue management teams at airlines, and their lone job, like there's a guy, or a gal, and she's looking at this many seats, and they're like, I need to put people in that seat for whatever they're going to pay me, and that number just gets lower, and they still show up. But if you look at, so India is fascinating right now, because by any metric, that country is growing like crazy. Right? It's massive. It's now the most populated country in the world. You also have the immersion of the middle class, which, happening at various rates. The propensity to travel is increasing. You can overlay China when they were at this point in their economy and say, well, if they do what China did, then they need more airplanes. I think there's also really good argument to be made that they can't do what China did because they don't have the control over the whole system that China had. But the idea that India as a market is growing rapidly and they've bought too many airplanes can both be true.
Absolutely can be, especially at the prices that they will be paying for those aircraft.
Yeah. Because we know
what
I don't
8
know.
years of escalation is going to do.
Yeah, what kind of escalation cap are you going to get today? It's not
Even if you got
3%,
right?
Yeah,
It compounds.
It
compounds.
3% 8 years from now when you're starting off at a higher base to begin with. It gets expensive, right? And like you say, I think the only solution is at some point it's just the cost of flying has to go up. Right? I think that's just the way it needs to be able to stay sustainable.
Or the cost of the aircraft stay the same or go down. Like that's still an option. Like the way I would always explain it when I was the buyer for CIT, I was buying all these airplanes. The way I would explain it to both Boeing and Airbus was, and everybody, we've all kind of touched on this, right? But what drives ultimately how much you can pay for the airplane is how much can you sell the tickets for, right? So that the aircraft can go from point A to point B, right? Its mission parameters are A to B with X number of passengers. And there's an operating cost to that. And there's cost of ownership, right? Pilots, insurance, fuel, so on and so forth, right? And you can reverse engineer, and then you look at that market and you go, okay, from A to B, there are X number of markets that I can go to in that range, and I can charge some price. I can back into exactly how much I can afford for the plane, whether it's a lease rate, a monthly amount, or a purchase finance amount, right? Whatever, how you finance it, it's a whole different topic. But how much can I pay for the plane? And, notoriously, right? I mean, Boeing and Airbus is trying to get the highest possible price for their product. And as the buyer, I'm trying to get the lowest possible price for their product. And, somewhere in there we could, is the strike price. But at the end of the day, people can only, and in India, if you're taking the bus for a few rupees, to go from here to there, you're not flying. It doesn't, the airplane, you could give away the airplanes. Those people are not getting off the bus, to Mike's point. So the number of people that can pay more is growing, which is great. But you back into it, that the price of that airplane is really high for what people in certain economic situations can pay, And it's funny because I think it's great when the industry is doing well as a aviation, someone who makes their living in aviation. That's good for me, right? But as a passenger, I hate it, right? Because I don't want to pay more. But so I'm kind of, it's the definition of conflicting feelings, right? Like it's great that they can charge more, but there's a limit. There's a limit because at some point it's just not worth it to spend the extra dollar, the incremental dollar, to fly from, I don't know, Buffalo to St. Louis, right? Or New York to LA, or LA to Singapore, or whatever it is, right? It's just, there's a tipping point, and then people just won't do it. So
now I've tried to make this argument during my 11-year career at an OEM that look at all this money this airplane's going to make you. You should pay more for this airplane. And it's like it's a order of 10. It's a magnitude of 10, right? I mean, it's like it's so much more.
Yeah.
Now, granted, they may not actually make that if there's too much capacity in the market, if fuel goes through the roof or whatever. You always want to get the lowest price. The reality is there's not actually value-based pricing. If it were, these airplanes would probably be going out the door for more than they are. But the market is truly driving this. to that point, consider what happens in 2030. Let's throw out, and Garrick and I have talked about this often, let's throw out the hypothetical proverbial 10-year downturn. Run of the mill, somebody pulls an Enron, and we've got a run of the mill recession. The first thing these airlines are going to do is let's say Air India or Indigo, if it hits them, they're going to go to Airbus and Boeing, and they're going to be like, hey, look, we want to defer those deliveries. What do you think they're going to say, having just gotten production up to whatever level it took them 10 years to get back up to?
Yeah, the OEMs, they're not going to...
Screw you, pay me.
Like, no, yep. It's going to cost somebody something.
Right.
And it's going to not be us, it's going to be you. So
right.
You're going to have to take the pain. And they will. Like, the OEMs will for a while.
But the OEMs
kind of lived through this. They will for a while to a point, and then they can't pass that risk back to the airline any further because
right.
They can't kill the customer base because then what, right? So at some point, eventually, the OEMs have to take some of the pain, and they have,
and they will.
We've seen it happen.
And they already know that they're going to face deferrals. If you're selling, 2,000 aircraft between Boeing and Airbus into the market, and at any given time, that some percentage of that 6, 7, 8 years from now is going to get deferred. Maybe there'll be a time when they need more, but there will be deferrals. And I think they build that in and they expect it, and they move airplanes among customers. And it's one of the things that the OEMs are really pretty good at, is moving stuff around.
Not to mention the great, what I'll call the great capacitor, accumulator, whatever you will, to use an electrical engineering term for you, John. From the OEM production side, you can consider lessors as a way to manage those fluctuations to an extent. In the market.
Yeah, that was part of our value story to the OEMs, because why would they sell to a leasing company, right? And the argument always was, number one, lessors are usually better capitalized than most, average airline, right? So they're going to be able to weather an economic storm a little bit better, and they're more likely to take delivery of their order book. Two, I don't know if this is still true, but at one point in time, I could say to them, in the downturn after 9/11, the downturn after the Gulf War, and other downturns that we experienced, that the lessors across the board took all of the aircraft that they had ordered, where the airlines were more likely to either cancel, default, or, there was I'm not saying that everything was delivered on the original schedule, but it all stayed in the order book. There were no, at that point, this goes back a number of years, there were no cancellations. I don't know if that's still true. So it creates a production line stability to your buffer, or capacitor, or whatever you want to call it, right? Some kind of spring mechanism that allows the production line to not directly be, impacted by cancellations, right? So it takes up some of that pain.
Yeah. Well, look, gents, it's we're getting close to the hour and a half mark. I did want to. This has been a great discussion. It's always nice to chat with you guys. I certainly enjoy the stories. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting close. I got a little more time, but I'm getting close to where I have to punch out. Couple things. One is, so how much of this are you actually going to use?
All of it.
You got anything?
All of it.
Anything's
all
usable?
Of it. Okay. Of course.
It's going to be a 5-minute. It's going to be a 5-minute episode after. I can't use that. Second, Courtney, where do you live now?
I'm in the North Dallas area.
Okay, so you're not around here anymore. Because we're getting together for breakfast on Friday morning. So
Garrick rubs that in my face.
Yeah. Well, Mike used to join too.
I know. Yeah.
So he's down in Florida. So
yeah.
Look, I didn't even make it to ISTAT last week. I make it to New York every year, and I try to do a 24-hour turn into New York and my aircraft mechanicaled, so I didn't even make it for that. So I'm sitting here by my lonesome.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Well.
So,
all right, and then Garrick, I'll see you on Friday the 13th.
Friday the 13th, that's right. But I did want to thank both of you for taking the time to kind of chat with us. Right, so it was great to chat with you. I appreciate all the stories. John, we didn't touch about your aerobatic stuff, unfortunately, but I did mention that in the intro. You know, I think it's pretty cool. You also have a couple of, I think you have one record with one of your other airplanes, and you've done some really cool stuff. So it's always fun to kind of chat about that. But I did want to thank you guys, and certainly, you know, wish you both the best with Jumpseat Advisor. You know, look, for anybody that's listening, right? I mean, you've got tons of experience, you know, and that's not just to say that you guys are old, but obviously you've got a lot of experience that is very valuable, right? I mean, that's really where the value comes in. And like you said, to not be able to make the mistakes by not having them made, right? Having people that kind of know and have gone through various leasing companies, tons of airlines dealing with that. I think that's so valuable. So I'm sure that people will recognize that, you know, with the tube.
Well, thanks for suggesting the podcast. Appreciate it. And, you know, if any of the listeners get, you know, a little nugget out of this that's helpful, great. If we rambled on too much, sorry about that. But thank you very much. And, you know, have a great holiday. And we'll catch up soon.
One question. Which of you guys is Justin Bateman in this thing?
Yeah. Who did you turn me onto that podcast?
Yeah. You mean Smartless?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Between the two of us, that's probably me. Probably me more so than I don't know.
I don't think of it more as like Jay Bateman and who's the other guy? He was from
what? Sean Hayes? Are you talking about?
Who's the third guy?
Third guy.
Anyway, Albright. It's not. It's terrible. Anyway,
I just blanked on his name.
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
Do it.
Will Arnett. There you go.
Will Arnett. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, real quickly though, I do want to, John, can you tell us a little bit about the podcast, where people can find it? For anybody who, what is okay flying upside down? Is that part of the 5-minute stories?
Yeah, it's called 5 Minute Better Pilot. It's little snippets on things I've learned over the years about flying. It's the target audience really is small aircraft, general aviation pilots or people involved in that area. There's, 15, 20 episodes out there now. They're like, it's 5 minutes, right? So the idea is if you listen to it for 5 minutes, maybe there's a little gem in there that'll make you a better pilot. And they're not necessarily humorous, but there's a little, they're entertaining. I try to make it a little bit entertaining, and I'm getting better at it, by the way. It's every podcast is a little better than the last.
That's the way it works.
Kind of how I fly, right? So to Garrick's point, I compete in aerobatics, and Rob Holland, who's an air show performer, national aerobatic champion, I was talking to him, and he said, the goal is to just fly a little better today than you did yesterday, and that's all I'm trying to get out of the podcast.
Awesome.
Very good.
Yeah.
And then I don't know if you have your slogan yet for the new venture, but might I suggest Jumpseat Advisor, the singular source for expertise.
Oh, I like it.
See,
I like it.
Lean into it. It's a power
That's
move.
way better. That's way better than Jumpseat Advisor. I can't remember the other thing I was going to say.
No. I changed my mind. Go with that.
I'm going to start a podcast, which is how come there's still nothing in the refrigerator?
Very good. Perfect. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us and for the banter and the experience. I love it. Thank you very much. Got to remember how to do this.
I know, it's been a while. It's been way too long.
What podcast is this?
It's the TBO podcast or MTBR. MTBR.
MTBR.
MTBR.
This is the MTBR, otherwise known as the Time on Wing podcast.
You know,
We gotta run businesses, startups, and a podcast. Come on.
I know. It's way too much, but it's still good. So today,
And cash all those checks.
I know, yeah.